Hi, and welcome to Danny After Dark. If you're new here, make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss a notification or a new episode. Tonight will be part one in my two-part series on Karla Homolka and Paul Bernardo. So let's go ahead and find out more. Let's go ahead and dive on in. Karla Leanne Homolka was born on May 4th, 1970 in Ontario, Canada. Born to Carol and Dorothy Homolka, she was the oldest of three daughters. Her sisters were Lori and Tammy. The family later moved to St. Catharines, Ontario. Karla began working part-time at a pet shop while she attended secondary school. After graduating in 1988, she was hired by a veterinary clinic to work as a veterinary assistant. She later worked a similar job at the Martindale Animal Clinic. Paul Bernardo, on the other hand, his start was a little bit unusual. His mother, Marilyn, was married to Kenneth Bernardo. He was physically abusive to her. After giving birth to a son and daughter, Marilyn had an affair with a previous boyfriend, and that is how Paul was conceived. Kenneth, however, he was open-minded about the affair, and on the baby's birth certificate, gave him the name Paul Bernardo. Kenneth later in life went to court for fondling a young girl. He was also hanging around the neighborhood at night, peeping into windows of young women, and he was sexually abusing his young daughter. Marilyn became so depressed and put on so much weight, she became extremely obese. She stopped taking care of the home, stopped taking care of the children, and withdrew into the basement of the house. As Paul grew up, he became involved in scouting. He worked summers as a counselor, and he was the most popular one among children. In fact, teenage girls, they adored Paul. However, when Paul was 16 years old, he got into an argument with his mother. It is then that she told him he was a bastard child. She then showed him a photo of his real father. Paul, he was devastated, and he began to hate his parents. After that, he would openly mock and taunt his mother, calling her a slob and a whore. By the time Paul went to college at the University of Toronto, his sexual fantasies developed a dark side. He preferred to have forceful anal sex. He sought submissive women, enjoyed humiliating women in public. He began beating up the women that he would date. Around this time, someone known as the Scarborough Rapist began to attack. The pattern was usually the same. When the victim got off a bus, he would grab her from behind and pull her to the ground. In the earlier assaults, he had fondled them sexually and penetrated one with his fingers. His later victims were not so lucky. He would force anal sex on them and force them to perform fellatio while talking to them the whole time. Then he would let them go. Within 2 years, the number of assaults had reached 11 victims. Then there were several months where there was no attacks. Then more rapes started to occur in 1988. The police could not identify who the Scarborough rapist was. Although they collected a lot of physical evidence from the victims, they were hoping it would support and push them in the right direction. They also had what they considered a really good composite drawing of the man who had assaulted these women. However, they did not widely release this composite drawing. One of Paul Bernardo's old girlfriends, Jennifer Galligan, went to the police several times about Paul regarding his brutal rape, physical abuse of her, and his threats to do her bodily harm. A report was filed, but nothing really came of it. Karla Homolka met Paul Bernardo at a Scarborough restaurant on October 17, 1987. They hit it off right away and started dating. She was 17 years old. He, 23 years old. May of 1990, years after the Scarborough rapes began, the police finally decided to publish the composite picture. By this time, Paul quit his job and was living entirely on a cigarette smuggling income. His former coworkers saw the composite drawing. They were in awe of how much it looked like their old coworker, Paul. In fact, an employee of Paul's bank contacted the police and reported one of their clients looked just like the composite drawing. However, at this time, the police were flooded with similar types of calls, so they didn't have the manpower to follow up on all of them. Eventually, a number of Paul Bernardo's acquaintances contacted the police about him, so a detective decided to pay him a visit. Paul didn't strike the detective as the kind of person who could be a serial rapist, but in good faith, Paul gave a blood, saliva, and hair sample. These samples, along with 230 other samples from other suspects, were tested. Only 5 of these samples fit the blood factors of the attacker. Paul Bernardo was one of the 5. So it was submitted for additional testing in April 1992. But by this time, the Scarborough rapist had mysteriously ended his attacks. So the case didn't have the type of urgency and priorities it originally did. So the samples went onto the back burner. By now, Paul and Karla, they were engaged to be married. And Paul was spending a lot of time at the Homolka home. While he was there, he would constantly flirt with Tammy Homolka. He became obsessed with Tammy, and he would peep into her window and watch her sleep and would masturbate. Karla knew about this, and she helped him by breaking the blinds of her sister's window to allow Paul easier access. In July, Paul took Tammy across the border to get beer for a party. While there, they got drunk and began making out. July 24th, 1990, Karla laced spaghetti sauce with crushed Valium she stole from work and served the dinner to Tammy, who soon lost consciousness. So then Paul began to rape Tammy while Karla watched. 6 months before Karla and Paul's 1991 wedding, Karla stole more drugs from her work. On December 23rd, 1990, Karla and Paul administered sleeping pills to Tammy in a rum and eggnog cocktail. After Tammy became unconscious, they undressed her, and Karla applied a halothane-soaked cloth to Tammy's nose and mouth. Karla wanted to give Tammy's virginity to Paul for Christmas. Because according to Karla, Paul was disappointed because he was not Karla's first sex partner. With the parents asleep upstairs, the pair videotaped themselves as they raped Tammy in the basement. Tammy began to vomit. Karla and Paul tried to revive her and later called 911. A few hours later, Tammy Homolka was pronounced dead. The official cause of death was choking on her vomit after consuming alcohol. Well, Tammy was now deceased, and Karla began searching for a sexual replacement for Paul, somebody very young and still a virgin. Karla knew a teenager named Jane who happened to look like Tammy, so Jane would be Karla's wedding gift to Paul. What? Jane idolized Karla and gladly accepted the invitation to go to the Bernardo's home. The first evening, Karla took Jane to dinner and spent so many hours talking to her and giving her alcoholic drinks. What Jane didn't know, these drinks were laced with drugs. After Jane passed out, Karla called Paul and told her they had a surprise gift. Well, he was thrilled when he saw Jane. She resembled Tammy, and she was a virgin. Once they undressed Jane, Paul videotaped Karla as she made love to Jane, who was passed out. Then Paul took her virginity. This was followed by a brutal kind of anal sex. Jane was so drugged, she didn't wake up at all. In fact, the next morning when she woke up, she was sick to her stomach and sore and met Paul, what she thought was for the first time. Jane had no idea what had happened to her. Paul went on to marry Karla in a huge, lavish wedding. Paul had controlled every detail of the wedding, like Karla's dress, her hair, and the food menu. June 15th, 1991, Paul came across Leslie Mahaffey, a 14-year-old who missed curfew and was locked out of her parents' home. She was unable to find anyone that she could stay the night over. Well, Paul found her and led her to his car. He then blindfolded her, forced her into the vehicle, and drove her to the Bernardo home. There, Karla videotaped themselves, torturing and sexually abusing Leslie. At one point, Paul said, quote, "You're doing a good job, Leslie. A damn good job. The next 2 hours are going to determine what I do to you. Right now, you're scoring perfect," end quote. The assault escalated. Leslie cried out in pain, begging Paul to stop. The following day, Paul claimed that Leslie gave her a lethal dose of drugs. Karla claimed that Paul strangled her. In the end, they put her body in the basement. The following day, the Homolka family came over for dinner at Karla and Paul's house. After dinner, Paul and Karla decided the best way to dispose of Leslie would be to dismember her, putting each piece in cement. So Paul bought a dozen bags of cement at a hardware store and kept all the receipts. June 29th, human remains were then later discovered at Lake Gibson. Orthodontic records had to be used to identify her. April 16th, 1992, Paul and Karla were driving around looking for potential victims. They spotted 15-year-old Kristen French walking home from school. So they pulled over and Karla got a map out of the car, pretending to need assistance. While Kristen looked at the map, Paul attacked her from behind, brandishing a knife, forcing her into the front seat of the car. From the back seat, Karla controlled Kristen by pulling down her hair. Kristen's parents became worried. She never came home, so they contacted the police. Within 24 hours, police had searched the area along her route. They found several witnesses who had seen the abduction. This gave police a fairly clear picture. In addition, one of Kristen's shoes was found in the parking lot. Over the next 3 days, Paul and Karla videotaped themselves as they raped, tortured, and sodomized Kristen. They forced her to drink large amounts of alcohol, to be completely submissive to Paul. She was never blindfolded. They then murdered Kristen before going to the Homolkas for Easter dinner. Karla claims Paul had strangled Kristen while she watched. Paul claims that Karla beat her with a rubber mallet and then tied a noose around her neck. In the end, Kristen Nude's body was found in a ditch on April 30th, 1992. On December 27th, 1992, Paul severely beat his wife Karla with a flashlight on her limbs, head, and face. Her parents took her to St. Catherine's General Hospital, where the injuries were documented, and she gave a statement to police. She claimed she was a battered spouse and filed charges against her husband, Paul. He was arrested, but then was later released on his own recognize. Karla moved in with her relatives. February 1993. Several years after the blood samples had been taken from Paul in that Scarborough rapist investigation, the forensic laboratory in Toronto finally got around to analyzing that blood. The tests proved conclusively that Paul had raped 3 of the victims and because of his semen samples. So Toronto police were informed that Paul's DNA matched the Scarborough rapist. They immediately placed him under 24-hour surveillance. Police interviewed Karla on February 9th, 1993. Despite the police telling her their suspicions about Paul being the Scarborough rapist, she didn't focus on that. She focused on his abuse of her. Later that night, Karla told her aunt and uncle that Paul Bernardo was the Scarborough rapist and that they were both involved in the rapes and murders of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French. And the rapes were recorded on videotape. That is the end of part 1 of Karla Homolka and Paul Bernardo. Thanks for sticking around for another episode of DNA After Dark. Make sure to watch part 2, which will be released next week. Do you have any questions or comments on this case so far? Leave it down below. Let's be interactive. Do you have a suggestion for a case that you'd like me to cover? Leave it down below. You may see it featured in an upcoming episode. Until next time, remember, we don't live in darkness. Darkness lives in us.